Field trips are supposed to be the highlight of the school year, a break from the monotony of classrooms, textbooks, and standardized tests. They're meant to be educational adventures, opportunities to learn beyond the walls of the school, to experience museums, nature centers, historical sites, and science exhibits with your classmates and friends. For most students, field trips are nothing more than cherished memories of bus rides filled with laughter, packed lunches eaten on grassy fields, and the thrill of being somewhere different for a day. But sometimes, field trips take a dark turn. Sometimes, what should be a safe, supervised educational experience becomes something else entirely. A brush with danger, a glimpse of something sinister, or an encounter with people whose intentions are anything but innocent. What you're about to hear are 3 true stories submitted by people who experienced field trips that went terribly wrong. These aren't tales of minor mishaps or embarrassing moments. These are accounts of genuine terror, of moments when young students found themselves in situations that no child should ever have to face. The first story comes from a middle school student who encountered threatening strangers during a nature preserve visit. The second is from a college student whose nighttime astronomy field trip revealed something lurking in the darkness. The third comes from a high school art class trip that led to a disturbing discovery in an abandoned area of Detroit. All names and some identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved, but the events described are real. Block 1, the Nature Preserve Incident. My name is Austin, and this happened when I was 13 years old in 8th grade at Riverside Middle School in Oregon. Our science class had been studying ecosystems and biodiversity all semester, and as a culminating activity, our teacher, Mr. Harrison, organized a field trip to Willow Creek Nature Preserve, about 40 minutes from our school. It was early September, still warm enough that we didn't need jackets, and the weather forecast predicted a perfect sunny day. We were all excited. Any excuse to get out of the classroom was welcome, especially when it meant spending the day hiking through trails and looking at wildlife instead of sitting through lectures about cellular respiration. The preserve itself was beautiful, spanning over 300 acres of protected wetlands, forests, and meadow areas. There were multiple hiking trails of varying difficulty, educational signs posted throughout explaining the local flora and fauna, and several observation platforms built over the marshlands where you could watch for birds and other wildlife. Our class of about 25 students was divided into groups of 5, each assigned to a parent chaperone who would keep track of us as we explored different sections of the preserve. My group consisted of me, my best friend Jake, and 3 other kids from our class, Emma, David, and Sophie. Our chaperone was Emma's mom, Mrs. Chen, who was nice but had a tendency to get deeply absorbed in reading every single informational plaque we passed, which meant our group moved slowly compared to the others. We started on the main trail, which was wide and well-maintained, with Mr. Harrison giving us all detailed maps of the preserve and instructions to stay on marked paths, check in at designated points, and return to the visitor center by 2 p.m. for lunch. The preserve had multiple trail systems, and while some were popular and frequently used, others were more remote, winding deep into less accessible areas. For the first hour, everything was normal. We saw a family of deer, identified several bird species using the field guides we'd been given, and collected leaves and took photos for our assignment. Emma's mom dutifully read every sign out loud, and we all pretended to listen while Jake and I made stupid jokes and David threw small stones into the creek that ran parallel to the trail. It was around 11 a.m. when Jake and I started to get bored. The rest of our group had stopped at yet another informational sign. This one about the different types of moss growing in the area, and Jake leaned over to me and whispered that he'd seen a side trail branching off about 50 feet back that looked more interesting than the main path. I glanced back at Mrs. Chen, who was taking photos of the moss plaque for her Facebook or something, and figured we could quickly check out the side trail and be back before anyone noticed. It was a stupid decision, the kind that only makes sense when you're 13 and convinced that nothing bad can actually happen to you. We slipped away from the group and jogged back to where the unmarked trail diverged from the main path. It was narrower, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and clearly not maintained by the preserve staff. Overgrown brush pressed in from both sides, and fallen branches littered the path. But it looked adventurous, and we were bored teenagers, so we took it. We walked for maybe 10 minutes, the sounds of other visitors fading behind us until all we could hear was the rustling of leaves and our own footsteps. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, then emerged at the edge of a large marshland area. There was no bridge or boardwalk here like there had been on the main trail, just muddy ground that gradually transitioned into standing water covered with algae and lily pads. We were about to turn back when Jake grabbed my arm and pointed. About 30 feet away, partially hidden by some bushes near the marsh edge, were two guys who looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. They were sitting on a fallen log, and even from a distance, I could see they were smoking something. Not cigarettes, the smell was different, sweet and skunky. Marijuana, though at 13 I'd never actually encountered it before. One of the guys was thin with shaggy hair and multiple facial piercings, wearing a stained band t-shirt and ripped jeans. The other was stockier, with a shaved head and what looked like prison tattoos covering his arms. They hadn't noticed us yet, and something about the way they were hunched over, glancing around nervously, made every instinct in my body scream that we should leave immediately. We started backing away slowly, trying not to make noise. But David, remember David, had apparently followed us, and he chose that exact moment to come crashing through the underbrush, calling out our names. The two guys' heads snapped in our direction. For a moment, everyone froze. Then the thin guy said something to his friend, and they both stood up. "Hey," the thin one called out, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't quite friendly. "What are you kids doing out here?" His hand moved behind his back, and I saw him tuck something into his waistband, either the drugs or possibly something worse. Jake grabbed my arm, and we didn't wait to find out. We turned and ran back down the trail, David scrambling after us, leaves and branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the undergrowth at a full sprint. Block 2, the nighttime observatory trip. My name is Rachel, and I was a sophomore at Western Oregon University when this happened in October 2019. I was taking an introductory astronomy class to fulfill a science requirement, and the professor, Dr. Martinez, had announced early in the semester that we'd be doing a night observation field trip for extra credit. The trip was scheduled for a Thursday night in late October, departing campus at 9 p.m. and returning around midnight. We'd be going to Starview Ridge Park, a relatively remote area about 20 minutes from campus that had minimal light pollution, perfect for viewing the fall constellations. Since it was extra credit and I was borderline between a B and an A in the class, I signed up without hesitation. On the night of the trip, about 25 students gathered in the science building parking lot. Dr. Martinez had arranged for a charter bus, and despite the late hour, everyone seemed excited. This was a lot more interesting than studying for midterms. The drive to the park was uneventful, filled with the usual college student chatter and complaints about other classes. When we arrived, the park was completely dark, except for a few solar-powered pathway lights near the parking area. Dr. Martinez led us to a large open field in the center of the park, surrounded on all sides by wooded areas. He'd brought several telescopes, star charts, and red-filtered flashlights that wouldn't ruin our night vision. The sky was incredibly clear that night, with no moon, and the Milky Way was visible as a hazy band across the darkness. It was actually beautiful in a way that made you understand why ancient people had been so obsessed with the heavens. Dr. Martinez spent about 15 minutes giving us an overview of what we'd be looking for. Jupiter and Saturn were both visible, The Andromeda Galaxy could be spotted with good eyes and dark conditions, and various constellations were at their fall positions. Then he distributed worksheets and told us we had about an hour to complete our observations. We were free to walk around the field and use any of the telescopes, but he warned us to stay in the open area and not wander into the surrounding woods. The park technically closed at dusk, and while we had permission to be there, it wasn't safe to go into areas where we couldn't be easily seen or where there were no maintained paths. I teamed up with my friend Jess from the class, and we moved to one of the telescopes set up at the far edge of the field, near where the grass transitioned into the tree line. We were working on our worksheets, taking turns looking through the telescope and trying to identify what we were seeing when I first heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible under the ambient noise of 25 students talking and moving around. But as I was bending down to write something on my paper, I heard it clearly. Footsteps in the woods behind us, the unmistakable crunch of dead leaves under someone's weight. I straightened up and turned around, shining my red flashlight into the trees, but the weak light barely penetrated a few feet into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jess. She nodded, her eyes wide. "Someone's in there." We stood still, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but now I became aware of another sound. Breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from maybe 20 or 30 feet into the tree line. It wasn't the breathing of someone who'd just been walking. It was the breathing of someone trying to stay quiet and failing, each breath too loud, too ragged. "Hello?" Jess called out, her voice higher than normal. "Is someone there?" No response, just that continued breathing. Then, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, I saw movement. A figure, tall and humanoid, but I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothing, just a darker shadow among the shadows. And it was moving parallel to us, staying just inside the tree line, pacing back and forth like an animal in a cage. My heart was hammering now. I grabbed Jess's arm and pulled her back toward where the main group was gathered. As we moved, the figure moved too, keeping pace with us. "Rachel, what the hell is that?" Jess breathed. I didn't know. Part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another student playing a prank. Maybe it was a homeless person who lived in the park. Maybe it was a deer or some other large animal that just looked humanoid in the darkness. But none of those explanations felt right. The way it moved was wrong, too deliberate, too focused on us. We were about halfway back to the central group when the figure finally stepped out from the trees. It was a man, or at least man-shaped, impossibly tall. He had to be at least 6.5 feet, maybe taller. He was wearing dark clothes, and in the faint ambient light from the stars and the distant glow of the city, I could just barely make out his face. It was pale, angular, and he was staring directly at us with an intensity that froze me mid-step. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we stared at each other. Then the man took a step toward us. That broke the spell. Jess screamed and we ran. Behind us I heard branches cracking as he pursued, crashing through the underbrush at the field's edge. "Dr. Martinez!" I screamed. "Someone's chasing us!" The entire group turned to look, and several of the guys in the class started running toward us. The moment they did, the figure stopped. He stood there at the tree line for another moment, his head tilting as if considering whether to continue. Then he turned and melted back into the woods so quickly and silently, it was like he'd never been there at all. Block 3, the Detroit Art Museum trip. My name is Marcus, and this story takes place during my junior year at Eastside High School in suburban Detroit. I was taking an advanced art history class, one of those courses that's supposed to look good on college applications, and our teacher, Mrs. Vandenberg, had arranged a field trip to the Detroit Institute of Arts downtown. It was a Friday in November, cold and overcast, and our class of 15 students plus Mrs. Vandenberg made the 40-minute drive into the city in the school van. The museum visit itself was normal. We spent 3 hours viewing various collections, taking notes for an essay we'd have to write, and mostly just trying not to look bored in front of Mrs. Vandenberg, who was deeply passionate about Renaissance paintings and medieval sculptures. The incident happened as we were leaving. The museum was located in an area of Detroit called Midtown, which had undergone a lot of revitalization in recent years, but it was still surrounded by neighborhoods that had suffered badly during the city's economic decline. As we walked back to where our van was parked, one of my classmates, a guy named Kevin, pointed out an old building across the street from the museum. It looked like it had once been a theater or opera house. You could see the faded grandeur in its architecture, the ornate stonework and tall windows, but it had clearly been abandoned for decades. Most of the windows were broken or boarded up, graffiti covered the lower walls, and part of the roof had collapsed inward. There was construction fencing around it, though several sections had been knocked down or cut through. "We should check it out," Kevin said, with that stupid grin he always had when he was about to suggest something against the rules. Mrs. Vandenberg was busy talking to the museum coordinator about scheduling a return visit and wasn't paying attention to us at that moment. Several students immediately said no, that it was dangerous and we'd get in trouble. But Kevin, never one to accept being told no, was already crossing the street. 2 other students, Amanda and Troy, followed him, more out of peer pressure than actual interest. I hesitated, caught between the desire to be seen as cool and adventurous and the nagging feeling that this was a terrible idea. In the end, stupidity won, and I jogged across the street after them. We slipped through a gap in the construction fence and approached the building's side entrance, where a door hung off its hinges, providing easy access. Inside, the building was a time capsule of decay. The lobby area still had the old ticket booth, its glass cracked but intact, and a grand staircase that led up to where the theater seating would have been. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, exposing water-damaged plaster underneath. The floor was covered in debris, broken glass, chunks of ceiling, pigeon droppings, and scattered trash left by previous trespassers. The air smelled of mildew, rot, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something chemical and unpleasant that made my eyes water. "This is so cool," Kevin breathed, already pulling out his phone to take pictures. "It's like something from a horror movie." We explored cautiously, sticking together as we moved through the ground floor. We found the main theater auditorium, its seats long since stripped or vandalized, the stage empty, except for a few pieces of rotted curtain material hanging from the ceiling. The floor sloped down toward the stage, and at the bottom, in the orchestra pit, was standing water that reflected what little light came through the broken windows above. Kevin was in the lead, with Amanda and Troy behind him, and I was bringing up the rear, my instincts screaming at me that we should leave. That's when Amanda screamed. We all froze. She was pointing at something on the far wall, near where the stage met the seating area. At first, I couldn't see what had scared her, but then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. A human hand, protruding from behind a section of collapsed scaffolding, fingers curled as if grasping for something that wasn't there. For a moment, we all just stood there in shock. Then Kevin, credit where it's due, was the first to move. "We need to check if they're alive," he said, his voice shaky but determined. We approached slowly, and as we got closer, the full horror of what we were seeing became clear. It wasn't just a hand, it was an entire body, a man probably in his 50s or 60s, dressed in dirty, tattered clothes. He was lying on his side, partially buried under debris from the collapsed scaffolding. His skin was grey and waxy, his eyes half open and clouded. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. This wasn't someone who'd just been injured. This was someone who'd been dead for a while, days at least, maybe longer. The smell that I'd noticed when we first entered, I realized now that a significant portion of it was coming from this body, the sickly, sweet smell of decomposition. Amanda was crying now, and Troy looked like he might throw up. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking, and dialed 911. While I was explaining to the dispatcher what we'd found and where we were, Kevin had moved closer to the body, his morbid curiosity overriding his good sense. "Don't touch anything," I hissed at him, but he wasn't trying to touch the body. He was looking at something near it, half buried in the rubble. "Guys," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "There's another one." He was right. As my eyes adjusted further and I looked around the orchestra pit area more carefully, I could see at least two more shapes that could only be bodies, partially hidden by debris and shadows. This abandoned theater had become a graveyard, whether by accident, neglect, or something more sinister. Conclusion: the police arrived at the theater within minutes of my call. They evacuated us from the building and called Mrs. Vandenberg, who'd only just realized we were missing. We gave statements to the police, explaining how we'd found the bodies. The investigation revealed that the man we'd found was a homeless person who'd been living in the abandoned theater and had died when part of the building collapsed on him during a windstorm 2 weeks prior. The other bodies we'd glimpsed were older, also homeless people who'd been using the building as shelter. None of them had been reported missing because they had no family or connections who'd noticed they were gone. It was a tragic reminder of how invisible some people become in our society, how someone can die and be forgotten, their body left to decay in an abandoned building for weeks without anyone looking for them. The field trip ended differently than any of us had imagined. Kevin, Amanda, Troy, and I all got suspended for 3 days for leaving the group and trespassing in a dangerous building. Mrs. Vandenberg was reprimanded by the school for losing track of students. But more than the official consequences, what stayed with me was the image of that man's hand, reaching out in death for help that never came. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about being trapped in that theater, about becoming another forgotten body in the darkness of that ruined building. As for Austin's story from the nature preserve, he and Jake made it back to their group. And when they reported what happened to Mr. Harrison, the preserve rangers were notified. They found evidence that people had been using that remote area for drug activity, but the 2 men were gone by the time rangers checked. Austin's school instituted stricter rules about field trips after that, requiring students to stay within sight of chaperones at all times. And Rachel's astronomy class? Dr. Martinez called off the field trip the moment he heard about the figure in the woods. Campus police came to the park and searched the area, but found no one. The strange part is that 2 weeks later, a woman reported being followed through that same park by a tall man matching Rachel's description. She managed to get to her car and escape, but the man was never identified or caught. Field trips are supposed to be safe, supervised educational experiences, but as these stories prove, sometimes the real world intrudes in ways no teacher or chaperone can anticipate. Sometimes a routine trip becomes a brush with genuine danger, a moment that stays with you long after the permission slips have been filed away and the school year has ended. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's this: stay with your group, follow the rules, and if something feels wrong, if you hear footsteps in the woods, if you notice someone watching from the shadows, if your instincts scream danger, trust that feeling and get help immediately. Because sometimes the scariest part of a field trip isn't what you're supposed to see, it's what you encounter when you wander off the path.